Hi, everyone. My name is Robert McLaughlin. This is Nir Chemaya, and we are both PhD students at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Uh, I am from the Department of Computer Science, and Nir is from the Department of Economics. Thank you for listening to our talk. I'll be talking about our paper, The Power of Default, Measuring the Effect of Slippage Tolerance in Decentralized Exchanges. In this talk, I'm going to be talking a lot about automated market makers. In particular, we're going to be investigating two, one called Uniswap and another called SushiSwap. Automated market makers are devices that exist on a blockchain and allow users to, in a decentralized manner, swap one token for another. The price at which users are able to swap is determined automatically. And so this is a very popular thing to use to avoid centralized exchanges. In fact, combined, these see well over $1 billion of daily volume. So they're pretty big. So why should we care about these? Well, we're going to be investigating how a certain setting is chosen on these different platforms. And that's actually very important because of a few different concepts in behavioral economics. I'll start with nudge theory. So this is the idea that the way in which you present choices to people will grossly impact the decisions that they end up actually making. For example, you might be going to a grocery store and you intend to buy just a bag of chips. But you get to the grocery store and you notice that on the shelf right next to them is dip. And you figure, I didn't want this before, but I think I'll buy it. So you put it in your cart and you end up buying it. Here you are actually nudged into buying that dip. You didn't intend to buy it before you got to the grocery store. And in fact, nobody forced you to buy it. It was just merely the way that the choice was presented to you that influenced what you actually ended up doing. So it's important that we understand the way we present these choices, and so that way we can influence the proper outcomes that people get out of their experiences. In fact, this effect is exaggerated in something we call the default effect, which is sort of the ultimate nudge. And put very, very simply, it's just the idea that people tend to stick with whatever is the default decision. In fact, we see this in a lot of different places, including, for example, when you started a new job, you have a whole bunch of default retirement options that are applied. Most people tend to just stick with the default. So it's very appropriate or very important to make sure that the default is appropriate for users in many different situations. Our study here is going to be looking at the default effect in DeFi. And in particular, we're going to be looking at Uniswap's setting called slippage tolerance and how people decide to set this setting. So this is our main idea. Uniswap's default slippage tolerance setting actually changed in mid-March of last year. And we're going to use this change to study its impact on users and how users' behaviors and outcomes were influenced both before and after this change. So we can answer some questions about that. So what is this slippage tolerance setting? Well, I mentioned that AMMs are automated market makers, and they allow users to buy and sell tokens for a price. Well, when you buy and sell these tokens, users have to go and generate a transaction, which waits a little bit before it's confirmed in the blockchain. And while you're waiting, the price may actually change just a little bit. So the slippage tolerance setting is actually a protection mechanism to protect the user from changes that are too big. In fact, the users set this slippage as a percentage of the current price to indicate how much movement out of their favor they're willing to tolerate before they don't wish the trade to happen at all. So in effect, the user is setting a limit price on their order. However, setting this is a double-edged sword. You may think that you can set it and just be done, but in fact, you need to think quite carefully about it. If you set it too leniently, then your transaction can be exploited through something called a sandwich attack. I'm going to talk about that later, but This is actually quite damaging. We estimate that total dollar amount lost is somewhere around $100 million annually just due to sandwich attacks. And it's also highly competitive. There are many bots that exist to exploit this type of attack. However, if you set your tolerance too strictly, it may cause unnecessary failures because the market price changed just a small amount, which you otherwise wouldn't really care about. But if you set the tolerance too strictly, would cause failure. In order to explain what is a sandwich attack, I'm first going to go through the basic flow of a typical way a transaction gets into the blockchain. It starts with Alice using in our case, the web interface of one of these AMMs to select the parameters of her trade and generate and sign the transaction. After she does that, she broadcasts it, and it ends up in the public mempool. This is publicly observable by everybody, and we see that her transaction is queued. Eventually, a block producer selects Alice's transaction for inclusion in a block and persists it into the next block. When this happens, the transaction is executed and entered into the historical record. A sandwich attack is very similar. It starts very similar in that Alice generates a transaction and broadcasts it into the public mempool. However, and as I mentioned, the public mempool is public. A sandwich bot has now detected Alice's transaction, and it realizes that it can make profit by exploiting it. The sandwich bot then collaborates with a block producer to create this sandwich attack. And here you can see it's called sandwich because they collude to produce a transaction both before and after Alice's transaction, which end up sandwiching it in between the two. And ultimately, the bot is actually able to extract profit at Alice's expense. So how does that happen? Well, here I've blown up the price movement over these few transactions. So you can see that the price changes in discrete intervals. You can see the price before the attack. After the first transaction runs, this is from the sandwich attack bot, the sandwich attack bot moves the price significantly out of Alice's favor. Then Alice's transaction executes, and she ends up overpaying by a gross amount for the swap that she wished to perform. In fact, you can see at this point, Alice was actually forced to perform the swap all the way up at her slippage limit, which is the worst possible price that she would be willing to accept. After Alice runs, the bot's last transaction runs, which ends up selling and moving the token price in the opposite direction, and ultimately it takes profit. In order to illustrate this, I've broken down some imagined amounts where you can imagine that maybe the bot ends up buying 200 units of token with 100 ether, and then it sells it back later. You can tell that the bot needs to do some accounting for fees as well. So, of course, the bot can only make profit if accounting for fees, they end up on top after doing all these operations. So what is the setting? So I'm going to take you back to the Uniswap web interface just to orient how this setting is changed. Here we can see a screen where a user is performing a swap. They're selling Ether and buying USDC. And if you click the gear on the top, then this menu will appear. In this menu, you can see that the user is able to either select a auto or custom setting for the max slippage. In this screenshot, it's set at auto at a flat 0.5%, which is in fact how it was set as the default for everybody at the beginning of March of last year. Then they introduced an auto setting in March 16th, where they had a soft launch of this new dynamic percentage scheme. In this scheme, users will actually have their slippage tolerance automatically tightened as they trade more and more volume in their trade. Here we can see that swapping 1 ether ends up with a tighter slippage tolerance than swapping 0.1 ether. And the reason for this is that trades that execute more volume are more profitable to attack by sandwich bots. By tightening up the slippage tolerance, the idea is that Sandwich bots will not be able to make a profit after accounting for the fees that they have to pay. This dynamic percent was eventually concretized on March 20th, and it ended up being dynamic between the range of 0.1% and 5%. So given this orientation, we ask a few different research questions. So we know that Uniswap changed their default setting for users of the web interface, and it became this dynamic scheme instead of a flat scheme that we talked about before. We happen to be recording transactions in the mempool at the very time of this change, so we leverage that in order to infer what percentage slippage each user set for their transaction. We ask the following questions. First, do users follow the default setting? And second, are people who follow the default setting better off with the new dynamic slippage setting, or are they not? We answer both of these questions in the affirmative, and we'll be talking in more detail about this in what follows.
Great. Thanks, Robert. So let's now go a little bit to the data and then show some of the results of the paper. So we able to have a data of the entire month of March, which allows us to do this event study. We focused on router-based swaps because they are represent users that interact directly with the web face of Uniswap. And also we exclude the transaction that's made by bots and third-party processors, which are less informative to the default decision. And we also focus only on swaps that were interacting with one liquidity pool because multi-pools transactions are more complex to back up slippage decision. However, we can see that it's captured the majority of the transactions on Uniswap. And in the end, based on our model, we back up slippage decision of the majority of the transactions available both in Uniswap and SushiSwap that we use as a control. So first, let's focus on SushiSwap, which is the control group in our experiment, in our event study, because during this entire month, while Uniswap changed their default to a dynamic mechanism, SushiSwap kept it with a flat default decision of 0.5%. And here we can see kind of the daily distributions of the transactions, and we can see very clear that in SushiSwap, almost the majority of the transactions are in this 0.5% flat default decision. When we look on the same data on Uniswap, first we can see that before the implementation of the new policy, we can see a lot of people make the default decision of the 0.5%. During the soft launch, we can see a drop. I guess they test it and then they change it back. But after they officially move to the new default settings, we can see that there is no more 0.5% dominant decision, and there are more actually decisions in the lower bound of the dynamic slippage decision, which is the 0.1%, as you can see here. Now, so our first research question is if users indeed stick with the default decision, and the answer is yes. We can see that in Uniswap, around 24% of the users are stick with the default. In SushiSwap, it's much greater. And we can see that after the change, this 24% is dropped to around 5%, which basically support that there was a change in the policy. And more than that, we can see that there is a big increase in the 0.1 slippage decision. And you can see that in before it was around 2%, and after it's increased to around 11. And again, the reason why we see more people stick with this decision is because it's the lower bound of the new dynamic mechanism. Now, one valid question that we want to answer in this paper is if users are better off. And first, we will focus on the loss from sandwich attacks. So again, let's start with sushi swap. So we can see that in sushi swap, if we calculate the daily loss from attacks per $100, and we do it in that way because we want to do apple-to-apple comparison to sushi swap, to Uniswap, we can see that before and after, in average, it's the same. There is no significant difference. However, when we do it in Uniswap, we can see that after the modification and the movement to the new dynamic slippage, we see indeed a big reduction in the loss from sandwich attacks. It's important to say that even that per $100, the loss from sandwich attacks is much lower in Uniswap compared to SushiSwap, given that there is much more volume on Uniswap, it's still a lot of money. Even that you see like 2 cents, which is very low, it's still a big amount of money, and it's sum up to millions, that, as Robert mentioned before. So in order to do a valid comparison, we need also to take into account the other trade-off, because if you have a very low slippage decision, you can protect yourself from sandwich attacks, but you also have a higher probability of unnecessarily failure transaction, and it means that you're going to pay gas fee for nothing without executing your transaction. So we wanted to see if after the policy change of Uniswap, if there is more unnecessary failures, and we can see that even though there is a little bit more, the gas losses after the change in Uniswap is still very low compared to the benefits from the protecting from sandwich attacks. It's actually the losses from sandwich attacks is 200 or 300 times greater. So we can see it as a very small loss in terms of welfare. So the best way to do to answer our research question if users are better off is to combine both the losses from failures transactions and from sandwich attacks and kind of calculate the combined impact. So in order to do it, we will split it to 2 different data sets. First will be the entire users in Uniswap and SushiSwap, and we can see that before the policy change in Uniswap, we see a big reduction, around 50% decrease in the total impact. So the welfare is much better after the policy change. While in SushiSwap, which is the control and there was no change, there is almost no change. But what it's even supports more our argument is that when we focus only on defaulters, users that we can classify as sticking with the default before the change and after the change, we can see that the decrease in the losses is even greater, is 90%. And while in SushiSwap, it's very similar to the aggregate data. And this kind of the main takeaway from this paper. So if we want to think about the future, what we can do. So first question is Uniswap dynamic slippage setup that the lower bound is 0.1%. And the question why, and if we can do better with changing it or maybe make it be smaller. And one indication that we can even maybe do better is that we can see in this CDF, we focused on slippage the decisions between 0.1% to known movement of the price, or which is 0 slippage. And we can see that if you look on the CDF, you can see that while users can reduce their slippage decision and protect themselves more against sandwich attacks, the probability of transaction failure is going to be very low. It's not that you're going to increase a lot your probability of a failure transaction. Actually, with zero slippage, you have more than 81% chance of executing your transaction, which is very high. Second element is maybe we can have a better dynamic slippage mechanism that's going to be more optimal and even improve our welfare for the traders. So the way to do it is maybe to create a mechanism that's going to take into account the probability of failure transactions. So basically have historical data of slippage decisions and failure transaction in the past, includes maybe more information about which pool you're going to interact, and maybe create something that's going to be much optimal and improve traders' welfare even more. Another important element, we did our analysis only for 1 month. It's worth to have a long-term data, a bigger data set that can kind of evaluate the long-term effect of this dynamic slippage. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you so much. This is the barcode for our paper. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everyone, and see you later.